This video is the first in a series on a modern adaptation of the historical Byzantine style of bookbinding. One unique characteristic of the Byzantine bookbinding is that the two halves of the book are sewn separately and then stitched together at the middle. This video will focus on how to sew one of these halves. The next video will focus on how the two halves are sewn together. In order to make this style of book, you will need your paper, which has been folded into gatherings of 4, cover boards, which have been prepared in the same manner as I used in the Coptic series of bookbinding videos. You will need an awl, an X-Acto knife, something to mark your pages with, and you will need a template to ensure that you place your holes consistently in your boards and your pages. The 3 long segments should be the same width, and the 2 outer segments should be ideally half the width of one of the inner segments. Depending on the size board you use, you may require a different set of measurements than what I have used. The boards themselves should be approximately the same height as your pages and slightly wider, approximately 1/4 inch. The first step is punching the holes in your cover board, and for this you will want a backdrop so that you don't damage your work surface. I line up my template with the bottom spine edge, and punch through the holes in my template with the awl. Like so. I will then do the same thing to the other cover board. You will notice that my paper does not have a definitive up or down. However, if it did, I would want to make sure that when I punch the holes in both spine edges, that up is the same direction. As an alternative to punching the holes directly, you can also mark the holes with the template and then punch them. You will want to make sure that the holes in your cover are large enough for your needle and thread to easily fit through, but not so large that your thread may wiggle while in the hole. After this, set your covers aside. In the traditional Coptic style of bookbinding, V-shaped grooves are cut through the center fold of each gathering in order to accommodate the bulky chain stitch that is used to sew them together. One easy way to ensure that you have the stations, which are the locations where you will be sewing, lined up with your covers, is to sandwich your pages between your covers and use your pencil to draw a line where each hole that you punched is between them. Now you have a mark on each gathering, so you know where to cut it. A V-shaped groove is easily cut with your X-Acto knife where you have marked each of your stations. You will want your groove to go through all of the pages of the gathering and extend approximately 1/8 of an inch into the page. You will repeat this on all of the stations for your gathering. Like so. You will then repeat this for all of your gatherings. Once you have finished cutting all of the V-shaped grooves, it is time to sew the book together. You're going to split your gatherings in half and place one half with each cover. This is to help keep separate which gatherings will be sewn with which cover. Take one set and set it aside for now. To sew them together, you will need a needle. A curved needle works best, but you can do this with a straight needle. You will also need thread. I use a waxed linen thread. The length of your thread should be the height of your gatherings times the number of gatherings plus at least one more length, and I generally do an extra length to account for the knots. This amount that I recommend is based on the fact that you will need to sew between each of the gatherings, and you will also be sewing through the holes in your cover and each time you sew through a gathering you will be going back to the previous gatherings. Based on experimentation, this amount of thread works well. If your holes are spaced farther apart on your cover, you may want to add a little extra thread. Thread your needle. And tie a knot in the other end. Your knot needs to be big enough that it will not pull through the V-shaped groove. To start, you will take your cover and your first gathering, you will go from the inside of your gathering to the outside through one of the outside holes. I choose the bottom hole. Make sure that your knot does not pull through. And then you will go through one of the corresponding holes on the cover. I generally choose the hole that is closest to the spine, because when the page is lined up further down, that hole is easiest to access. You will be going through both holes either way, so it doesn't really matter. Pull your thread gently but firmly all the way through the hole. Flip your gatherings out of your way so you don't accidentally stab them, and go back through the other hole at that station, from the outside of the cover to the inside of the cover. And then go back through the hole in the gathering that you came out of. Make sure that you do not try to go through the knot. It doesn't work very well. You want to pull your thread so that it is taut, but you do not want to pull it so tightly that you risk ripping the edges of the paper. You also want to make sure that the holes in your cover line up with the spine of your gathering, and that this stitch on the front cover is taut. And then you will go to the next station in order. Go from the inside to the outside of the gathering. Go through the hole in the cover closest to the spine edge, from the inside of the cover to the outside of the cover. Flip your gathering out of the way. Go through the other hole at that station, from the outside of the cover to the inside of the cover. I clearly did not pierce this one large enough. And then go back through the hole in the gathering. You want to make sure that you end up in the center of the gathering and not into one of the other pages of the gathering. Again, pull gently but firmly so that all of the stitches are taut. You don't want slack in any of the stitches. Like so. Do the same thing at the next station. Go from the inside to the outside of the gathering. Go through the hole closest to the spine edge, from the inside to the outside of the cover. Flip the gathering out of the way. Go through the other hole at that station, from the outside to the inside of the cover. and then go back through the hole in the gathering. Make sure the thread is taut. And go to the next hole. This last hole is a little different, but it starts out the same. You'll go from the inside to the outside of the cover through the hole closest to the spine edge. Flip the gathering out of the way. Go through the other hole at that station from the outside to the inside of the cover. And then you are going to bring your thread back to the spine, but not back through the same hole. You're going to take your next gathering, and you're going to go through the corresponding hole in that gathering from the outside to the inside. And proceed to the next hole. From the inside to the outside of the gathering. Byzantine bookbinding is sewn together with a link stitch, an unsupported link stitch. So the link is linking to a previous gathering. So you're going to go underneath the stitch that attached the first gathering to the cover, around it in a loop, and then back into the gathering that you came out of. And proceed to the next station. You will do the same thing here. You will loop under the stitch that attached the first gathering to the cover. This is where a curved needle is very handy. It can be done with a straight needle, as I will demonstrate on the next one. If you're working with a straight needle, what you can do is feed your needle into the gap between, in this case, the first gathering and the cover. Flip to that gap, pull your needle through, and then send it back through the gap on the other side of the stitch. This is not as time efficient, but it will work if you don't have a curved needle. Now for this outside stitch, rather than making a simple loop, we're going to curl under the stitch that we just made, forming a sort of twisted chain stitch. And then we will add the next gathering to the stack. And we will enter that gathering from the outside to the inside at the corresponding station. Go out at the next station. Another characteristic of Byzantine binding is that it uses what's called an extended link stitch, or a double chain, which means that you count back not one stitch each time, but two, once you have two stitches to count back. So in this case, the loop will be formed around the same stitch between the first gathering and the cover. And then back into the hole in the gathering that you came out of. And you'll want to make sure as you go that your stitches are nice and taut. So tighten as needed, but again, gently. Do the same thing at the next station. Count back 1, 2, loop under, go back into the same gathering. Again, count back 1, 2, and again, before you pull this loop all the way tight, put your needle through so that when you draw it fully tight, it will form a twisted chain stitch rather than a regular chain stitch. Add your next gathering to the stack. Go from the outside to the inside at the corresponding station. Go out the next station. And again, you will count back 2 stitches. 1, 2. In this case, this stitch is the one between the first gathering and the second gathering. So you will loop under, and back through the hole in the gathering. As you work, you want to make sure that the edges of the spine, the center fold on each of the gatherings, is lined up with the previous gatherings and with the spinemost holes in your cover board. So count back 1, 2, and go back into the same gathering. And you will want to make sure that your stitches are taut. As you see, this one is not. It is easiest to correct them when you're doing them, or at least are still working in the same gathering. So you'll lightly catch your stitch with your needle, pull it taut, and then pull the other side taut. Do the same thing here. There we go, and now it's taut. So we're at the end again, so count back 1, 2, loop under, and then back through, and then pull taut. And you will continue doing this for all of the gatherings on this half of the book. You will notice that this forms a fairly bulky chain that, if you cut the V-cut grooves correctly, will fit within the V-cut grooves and remain relatively flush with the edge of the center fold of the paper. If you cut your V-cut grooves too shallowly, this chain may sit a little bit above the edge of the paper and form a noticeable bump. This is not necessarily a bad thing, but it is not in keeping with the historical Byzantine style, where they would be as flush as possible. A primary difference between the modern Byzantine adaptation and the historical Byzantine style is the boards used for the cover. In the historical Byzantine style, they would be wood and rather thick, at least half an inch, or at least on average half an inch. The holes that would be drilled through them, the hole more towards the center would be drilled perpendicularly, but the hole more towards the edge would be drilled obliquely so that it comes out on the spine edge of the wood. This would enable you to have the edges of the paper flush with the board at that edge. Due to the thinness of the pasteboard material, the pressboard material that is being used for the covers of these books, this is not possible. And thus this is a modern adaptation rather than true to the historical style. But the method of stitching is the same. Count back 1, 2, under, and through. And this is the last gathering for this half. Count back 1, 2. Count back 1, 2. The last hole. Count back 1, 2. Under and through. As you can see, I have a fair amount of thread left over. Part of this will be required to sew the two halves together, but I will still have some excess. This half of the book will be set aside while the other half of the book is sewn. Once both halves are completed, then you will sew the two halves together. I will make a separate video showing how to do this. One important note is that when you're sewing the two halves together, the threads need to be on opposite sides of the book. In order to ensure that this happens, you should take note of where the thread ends on the first half relative to where it began. In this case, for an odd number of gatherings, the thread will end at the opposite side of where it began. Make sure that when you sew the other half of the book, the thread will end in the proper spot.